Hey there, if you missed ELA today, here is your lesson in brief. I also have the full slideshow, so I'm not going to show all the videos that we watched. You can watch those, but here's just me telling you kind of what we did. We're starting a new unit today called Catching the Light, and it's all about the sun. So our big question is, what is the power of the sun? So if you go onto our slideshow, I am 99% sure, you can watch this video that kind of just overviews what we'll be focusing on. But so all of our reading and all of those things will be having something to do with the sun and the power of the sun, including our science soon too. So that's kind of exciting. So there's the little video right there. You can watch it. Our learning targets today were to learn some new vocabulary words, understand a character in a story by being empathetic to their situation, and identifying the conflict and resolution to a story. You'll need your vocabulary notebook, something to write with, and you'll reach for a reading book. So the 3 words we added today were assume, theory, and absorb. So assume, I assumed you all knew how to create a Google slideshow and share it. I should have asked you first. Or don't assume you know the way, check your map. So think to yourself, what does assume mean? Hopefully you had something to do with this. When you assume something, you think it's true without checking the facts. So one synonym could be guessed. I guessed you all knew. It's not exactly a guess. It's like just kind of believing something to be true without making sure. So it's along the line of guessing. Theory, the Big Bang Theory explains how the universe was created, or her theory is that the dog did it. So what do you think theory probably means? And a theory is an idea that explains something. It usually takes into account some type of evidence or ideas. It's similar to assume, but not quite. You usually have some facts to back up your theory. There's a reason for it. And the final word we added today was absorb. The picture is exactly what you're thinking. The sponge absorbs the water. Wearing black can help you absorb the sun's heat. And we talked about in class that absorb can have a lot of different meanings. We can be talking about learning, we can be talking about water, we can be talking about heat. So when you take something in and hold on to it, you absorb it. So you can see how you might be doing that with your learning. You might take something in and hang on to it, you've absorbed it. If it just washes over you, you may not have absorbed it yet. Okay, so it's another way of saying take in. The sponge takes in water. Wearing black can help you take in the sun's heat. So our comprehension strategies for today, we used 2 different strategies. We identified the conflict and resolution in a story, basically what is the problem, and we used empathy to better understand characters in a story. So conflict and resolution, the conflict is the problem. You've hopefully heard that before in a story. There's maybe a fight, a struggle, a challenge, something facing the character. The conflict creates the interest in the story and makes you want to know what happens next. The conflict is the problem. It will be solved during the story, but know that it's not always solved the way that you might like. It doesn't mean there has to be a happy ending. It just means that something does happen to resolve or end that problem. The way that it is solved is called the resolution, and you can see solution is right there in resolution, and it's because we have problem solution, conflict resolution. So we're going to look back at some of the stories we've read before. We've got My Diary from Here to There was the story about Amada, who had to immigrate to the U.S. and was afraid she would miss her friends. So that was her conflict. The resolution was that she found a nice place to be happy and think about her friends and family, and kind of found a little bit of a calmness within herself. She didn't get to go back to Mexico, but she found a way to resolve her conflict. A Refugee Remembers, remember that's the true story about John Boldow, who was attacked in war and lost his family and his home. And so how was his conflict that he didn't start, or did Amada, resolved? He found a new life in America, and now he goes on to help others in Sudan. So again, he had a conflict, there is a resolution. We also read The Journey to Gold Mountain, The Chinese immigrants were blamed for American joblessness and low wages, and the resolution was not a resolution that was really helpful for the Chinese immigrants. The resolution or the result of this conflict was that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, making it harder for Chinese people to immigrate to the U.S. So like I say, sometimes the resolution is not what we would think of as a solution. We want a solution to be a positive outcome. It isn't always. And some of the most interesting stories have outcomes that are not the positive. So we read this story on page 83 and talked about the conflict. So I'll read it to you quickly. How the sun got hot again. Astronauts Sophie and Carl were ready to go into space. They were on a special mission. The sun had been growing colder every day. It was getting harder and harder to survive on Earth. Sophie had an explanation. A thermal force deep inside the sun had stopped working. If her theory was right, setting off a huge explosion on the sun's surface should strengthen its power. The spaceship took off before long. The sun was a huge ball right in front of them. It was as majestic as they had imagined it. The heat shields on our spaceship are working, Sophie noted. At this point, what is the conflict or the problem in the story? Yep, the sun has been growing colder every day and it was getting harder to survive on Earth. Quite a conflict. Let's read the second half. We'd melt if they weren't, talking about the heat shields, Carl said nervously. Soon it was time to send off the explosives. Sophie pressed a button. The little ship, holding the explosives, made its way to the sun. Sophie turned the big ship around. They needed to get far from the sun before the explosion. Kaboom! The shockwaves rocked the spaceship. Sophie spoke to Mission Control. It worked, she cried. Excellent, Carl exclaimed. I assume that tomorrow's headlines will read, Astronauts Save the Sun. This event will go down in history. So, what was the resolution or solution to the conflict? The explosion worked and the sun was saved. So this is a very simple, tie it up with a bow story that kind of shows conflict and resolution. So this is a little video you can watch that kind of really deeply explains empathy using the story Wonder as an example of how you can better understand characters in the story using empathy. So I am not going to play it here.
Today we're going to talk about
can choose to watch that on your own through the slideshow. So talking about our two characters, Sophie and Carl, remember empathy is trying to be in the same shoes or feeling what others are feeling. So how is Sophie feeling during the mission and how do you know? And how is Carl feeling during the mission and how do you know? So we reread the story in class, which you can do as well because you have your book. And reading it again, look for kind of clues as to how is Sophie feeling about the mission. Is she sure of herself? Is she nervous? What about Carl? Is he nervous or is he sure of himself? Who's kind of being in charge here? So looking back, Sophie. Look, Sophie's feeling pretty confident during the mission. She has a solution. She has a theory. She steers the ship. She feels ready to know. She has a theory. She notices that the heat shields are working. So everything she says is positive about this mission. How is Carl feeling during the mission? Look back at what he says about the heat shields. He's a little more worried than Sophie. Now, he's not in charge, and sometimes when you're not in charge, it's harder to feel confident. He says they would melt if the heat shields weren't working, and the author uses nervously to let us know that he's not quite as confident as Sophie. So tonight you are reading 10 Suns, and that is your independent practice for ELA. You do have a reading log to do tonight, so you may want to just use this as your reading for that. It shouldn't take you 30 minutes, but maybe you'll read it twice. There is audio support available on Google Classroom, and tomorrow we're going to talk about conflict and use empathy to understand the characters in the story 10 Suns. There's quite a few different conflicts and a lot of different characters to keep track of. So read it very carefully and be ready to talk about it tomorrow. Thank you. I hope you feel better, and we will get to work together tomorrow. I don't know why they go there.